Hello everybody, today we are going to present a research we made in recent months in which we built a profile of one of the most active exploit developers for Windows. We are going to show how we were able to track down 11 of their exploits for the Windows kernel, and many of which were zero-day at the time of development. So just before we start, let us give you a brief info about who we are. My name is Itay Cohen, I'm a malware researcher and a reverse engineer at Checkpoint Research. I'm also one of the maintainers of the open source reverse engineering framework Radar 2 and the maintainer of Cutter. With me today, my friend and colleague Eyal Itkin. Eyal is a vulnerability researcher at Checkpoint Research as well. So, just like many other good stories, our story began with an incident response case. The incident response team in Checkpoint reached out to us with an interesting and a complicated attack against a client. And in this attack, we noticed one specific binary that caught our interest. It was a very small 64-bit PE file that looked suspicious. It contained unusual debug strings that suggested that we are looking at an attempt to exploit an LPE vulnerability. It also had a PDB path inside it that did not leave a lot of place for imagination regarding what this file is, as it stated very clearly that this is CV 2019-859. So we quickly reverse engineered the binary. It was pretty straightforward. The vulnerability was a use after free in create Windows X, and it was used to elevate the privileges of the parent process to system. And this is not the first time that we see an attack utilizing an exploit, and the leftover strings and the PDB path made us believe that we are looking at yet another script kiddie that downloaded an implementation of the exploit from GitHub or some other public resource. But as we quickly found out, this was not the case. We simply could not find any public resource of this specific implementation, not on GitHub and not anywhere else we looked for. The implementation was completely unique. Also, we noticed something interesting. The exploit itself was probably not written by the developers of the malware in the attack. And we have several things that suggested that this is the case. The first one is that there was difference in quality of the code. With all due respect to the malware in the attack, the exploit was simply better written. The separation to functions, the check for versions, and other things suggested that it was written by another person. Next, while the malware and its modules were all obfuscated, the binary of the exploit was not, and it was very clear for us as reverse engineers to see what was going on in there. Also, the timestamps of the binary were different. The exploit was compiled before the malware, and I'm not talking about single day differences, but something more meaningful. And the PDB paths were different, suggesting that the binaries were compiled on different machines. So take all this, add this to the fact that the small exploit was in a separated binary, and we can guess that we are talking about different developers here. And this was the starting point of our research. And to understand why it is meaningful, we need to understand the basics of acquiring and embedding exploits in malware. So usually we tend to look at malware as one complete software, sometimes with modules, sometimes not, and we treat this software as it was written by a single person, a team, or a group. But the truth is that writing an advanced malware, either by nation states or criminals, involves different people with various skills. So say if you're an operational entity and you want to use an exploit, you cannot rely on your malware developers alone. Finding a vulnerability, reliably exploiting it, and all these most probably should be done by specific teams or individuals who specialize in this particular role of exploit development. And if we are talking about the malware developers, on their part, they don't really care how it works behind the scenes. They just want to know the API, this integration point that they can use to integrate the exploits in the malware. Now, there are multiple ways that malware developers can acquire an exploit. And if we are speaking of big organization here, they can get the exploits from a team in their organization. And they can also get the exploits from a team in another organization, if we are talking about collaboration between multiple intelligence agencies, for example. They can purchase the exploit from quote-unquote legal entities, such as offensive cyber companies or exploit brokers. And of course, they can buy the exploit from users on underground forums, or maybe the most accessible and the most popular way that we see nowadays is to simply download the exploit from GitHub or other public sources. And now we'll move to the next part, in which Eyal will show how we were able to extract and fingerprint unique characteristics of the exploit developer behind the exploit we found, and how we hunted for these characteristics and found many other exploits written by the same developer.
Thank you, Itay. If you want to focus on the exploits themselves, then we need to think like an exploit writer. And the most important rule to remember is that our exploit is our product. This isn't some script of proof of concept that we upload to GitHub and forget about. This is the product that the client actually paid for. And the client wants us to support as many versions as possible. We need to support both 32 bits and 64 bits targets, as well as many Windows versions as possible, ranging from Windows XP and Vista and up to Windows 10. And since we need to support so many Windows versions, we will need some way to fingerprint the exact version used by our target and calibrate our exploit accordingly. In addition, we'll most probably need some direct access to a given syscall somewhere along our exploit, meaning we will need an additional syscall gate, most probably written in assembly, and the precise syscall numbers used per operating system version. And the parts that I just described are actually exploit agnostic. We will need them in many exploits out there, and we can implement them as utilities to be used in some sort of an exploit template over and over in all of our exploits. And this is the key point in our research. We're going to hunt down for the author's exploit template and match it. So, what are we looking for? Well, we're looking for the usual suspects. We have unique artifacts, such as hard-coded values, strings, PDB paths, as well as author-specific code snippets, inline assembly, syscall wrappers, everything we could use in order to hunt down for more exploits. However, assuming we have an initial exploit, we will also want to attribute it. So we have the framework, configuration used per exploit, the code structure, or even the API between the exploit and the malware. We also have more exploit-specific artifacts as favorite infoleak primitive used from the kernel to the user, a way to elevate the target process from normal privileges to system, and so on and so forth. Now that we know what we're looking for, it's time to recall that we have a 64-bit sample and we can search for artifacts in it, which we did. And eventually we found a basic artifact and we started a basic search with it, which is a shot in the dark. You can never know if you found a popular code snippet from GitHub or an exploit tutorial, or if you found an actual artifact of the author. And to our surprise, it worked. We found a matching 32-bit sample of the same exploit. And now we have both the 32-bit sample and the 64-bit sample of our exploit, which is great. Using these two samples, we can compare them and check if our author has a single exploit template for both of the versions using ifdefs in the matching places, or if they have two templates, one for 32 bits and the other for 64. Since the rule worked, we started an excessive hunt, which was basically based on this rule, and meanwhile we kept looking on for more rules we could use. One day later, we got the result, and we couldn't believe what we actually found. We found 949 different samples just from the initial hunt. So we found multiple malware families across various years, and it looks like the real thing. We found a lot of exploits of our author. It's time to dig in. Before we could identify the author, we will need to identify the vulnerabilities that were exploited and hope that one of them was already attributed to our author or to a known author we could identify with. Identifying the vulnerabilities themselves was a tedious task because it took quite a lot of time per exploit. And if the vulnerability was exploited as a zero-day, it's usually easy. It's usually well documented in security reports, detailing the exact time ID used, unique constants, the flow of the exploit, and so on and so forth. However, if the vulnerability was exploited as a one-day, it's a totally different story. We usually get nothing. We just need to revert to old reverse engineering, patch testing, and testing in different setups to see in which patch use day was the vulnerability fixed. However, sometimes we do get lucky, and we have the CVE in a plain strings or in a PDB path, but we can't really count on that because most of the times we won't have such strings, and sometimes it turns out that the strings are wrong for some reason. We found the following CVE in one of the samples, but the sample didn't exploit this vulnerability. So we don't really know what we found, why we found this CVE, but that's life. In some of the exploits, we found that vulnerabilities were probably located from patch diffing Microsoft fix, meaning we don't have any clear documentation on the vulnerability and no clear mapping between the CVE of that patch and the vulnerabilities that were fixed. So we had to manually go over all of the list and find the most suitable CVE for the vulnerability, in which case we attributed to the following CVE. Now that we found all of the vulnerabilities, it's time to present our author. Our author is Volodymyr, or Volodya, also known as BuggyCorp, as previously discovered and talked about by Kaspersky. Our author develops exploits since 2015, at least to our knowledge, and includes a list of respectable known clients, such as Turla or Fin8, and even GunCub. Volodya exploits both 1 days and 0 days, and we are focusing on Windows local privilege escalation vulnerabilities because this is the exploit template we started with and hunted for. We were able to track down 6 different 1 days, you can see on the list here, and an additional list of 5 different 0 days, bringing to a total of more than 10 different vulnerabilities that were exploited and solved, which is quite impressive. Before we could identify the fingerprints, we need to remember that we can't simply pick an arbitrary code line and say, well, this is an artifact, because it could be a well-known code snippet from an exploit tutorial or from GitHub. We can't really know. So we need some way of having a control group to compare against and cancel out false positives. Our goal is to show that each exploit writer is unique, meaning that had multiple implementation or exploitation decisions to make. Each decision was a real one, indeed faced multiple options, and was consistent once chose a given decision. And this means that the set of decisions made by the author could comprise a unique fingerprint of the author, and we could use this fingerprint in order to hunt down for more exploits or attribute them to our author. In order to do that, we reiterated the research method on Eyal, which embeds a 1-day exploit for the following vulnerability. And once again, a research technique worked. So our control group is Playbit, also known as Laxo 2008. We found it to develop exploits since 2013, and known clients include Eyal and Lockcrypt and other crimeware. Playbit only exploits 1 days, at least to our knowledge, and we were able to find the list of the following 5 1 days that were exploited and sold. Now that we have all of the lists settled up, it's time to focus on the author's fingerprints. The first clue we have is a call to sleep. It turns out that most of the exploits start with a call to sleep 200 millis. We're not sure exactly why is it there, but it is a distinct feature. You can't argue about that. At a certain point on our research, when we found a new exploit, we went to the beginning of the exploit and looked for a call to sleep. If you found sleep, we knew it's a Volodya sample, and then we looked for more artifacts just to be sure. So we start with a sleep. The second clue is OS fingerprinting. The goal of this phase in the exploit is to query for the major and minor version number of the operating system in order to check if the target is vulnerable and to calibrate our exploit accordingly. And it turns out that Volodya's favorite method is directly parsing both the values from NTDLL's image and the headers, as we can see here in the code snippet. We couldn't find this technique used anywhere else, not in Playbit exploits, not in exploit tutorials or in GitHub. So we found it to be quite unique to Volodya, and it uses this technique in most of the samples that we found. And the last technique for these slides, more techniques will be found on our white paper, is the token swap. In order to elevate the target process according to the process ID, we will need the system's token, and we will we will want our process to point at it. The favorite method in order to do that is scanning the process list, known as PS list. We will use an arbitrary read and arbitrary write exploit primitives from user mode in order to access and read and write memory into the kernel. We achieve these exploit primitives using our initial vulnerability. Using these primitives, we traverse the process list and search for the e-processes of both of our target process and system, and we update our target's e-process in order to point at the system's token. Since the token is a ref-counted object and we just added an additional reference, there is some delicate ref count handling we will need to do in order to avoid a blue screen when the target process exits. And the token is an xFast ref object, which means that the lower pointer bits are actually used as a ref count. If we want to access the actual address of the token, we need to mask them out. In addition, the object header is stored before the token, and once again, it holds an additional reference count. Since Volodya wants to update the reference count in the object header, the steps are mask out the bits of the token, subtract 18, read the value, increment it, and store it back. However, on 32 bits, we found the following bug, which meant that the alignment mask in the read operation is an alignment to 8, but the mask in order to write again the value is a different mask. It's an alignment to 16. So if the token is aligned to 8 bits but not to 16 bits, we will read the value but write it to a different address, meaning essentially this is a bug. So we couldn't find it on 64 bits, but it was quite consistent on all of the 32 bits samples. So both the token swap are quite indicative, but the bug is a clear clue that we're talking about a Volodya exploit. Back to you, Itay.
So as you understand, we had the opportunity to analyze many samples and exploits written by Volodya from 2015 to 2019. And while analyzing these samples, these 11 exploits, we noticed a learning curve in Volodya's skills and behavior. So just before we are going to explain this learning curve, we want to mention that it was clear from the start that Volodya was already quite professional from the first exploit we saw them implementing, the CVE 2015-2546, the earliest exploit we were able to attribute to Volodya. Now, the first thing we want to talk about is how Volodya moved from selling source code to selling compiled binaries to their clients. And we have some evidence to suggest it. First, the code of the exploit was properly embedded in the binary. We did not see any weird patching in there. It looks like the malware author simply placed the exploit in the source code of the malware, and the flow between the malware and the exploit was very smooth. Second, a source level obfuscation was applied both to the malware and to the exploit. And that means that the obfuscation was executed on the source code of the exploit. And this also means that whoever wrote the malware and executed the obfuscation had access to the source code of the exploit itself. And last, the exploit elevated the privileges of the current process and not of the parent process, as we saw earlier. Later, we believe that Volodya started to sell the customers compiled binaries. So unlike before, now the exploits were usually shown as separated binaries and not part of the malware itself. They also contained hard-coded prints with instruction to the customers describing each step the exploit does. So if the customer had the source code itself, they would probably remove those prints. And last, the elevation of privileges was for the parent process and not for the current running process. We also noticed technical improvements in the exploits themselves. So as Volodya got better and more experience, he started to using more effective arbitrary read and arbitrary write primitives. We also noticed that he fixed a bug in these primitives between two CVEs a few years ago. He also started to write a more modular code and split large functions to smaller subroutines. And this, of course, is best practices in programming, but also for us as reverse engineers, it's easier to reverse and understand each function in the binary. Also, the way he searched and accessed specific offsets in various structs was also improved. Now, in more recent implementations, it was more dynamic and safer, as it better handled changes in minor versions of Windows. And overall, we can say that the exploit became more sophisticated and better implemented. So we talked about Volodya, and now it's time to ask who were Volodya's customers. And this table we made is showing the CVEs that we were able to attribute to Volodya. And also it shows the customer that purchased the exploits from Volodya. And CVEs that are marked with blue are 0 days and naturally more expensive. And the highlighted groups that you see on the left are APTs. So we are seeing a mixture of both crimeware like QRSNIF and Magniber, and APTs like APT28 and Tula. And we can see that Volodya's most happy customer was URSNIF or Dreambot, which is the Japanese campaign. And at least until 2018, they bought 5 exploits from Volodya. We can also see APT28 buying 2 0 days back in 2016 and 2017. And another interesting story here is Buchtrap, a group that started from cybercrime and then, as ISAT revealed last year in VB, moved to cyber espionage, most likely under the Russian government. So let's have a quick conclusion, what we learned from this research, what we learned from this presentation. First, we understand that our research methodology worked. Fingerprinting exploit developers, hunting for their exploits is possible, and it worked fantastic for both Volodya and Playbit. We found 16 Windows local privilege escalation exploits written by these two developers, by Volodya and Playbit, between 2015 and 2019. And this is especially interesting because it is a significant share of the exploitation market, specifically for Windows LPE exploits and specifically for Volodya. But we need to remember that these are only exploits that we found in the wild, and we are suffering from the survivorship bias. We know only what we know, and we cannot help but wonder how many more exploits are out there that we did not catch yet. We saw that the customers of such exploits were both crimeware and nation-sponsored groups. It's very interesting to see that APTs like Tula or APT28 are buying exploits in addition to developing exploits in-house. And finally, and maybe the most important one, is that we invite you all to try this research methodology as well. So if you have the resources to do this, you might end up with a very, very nice results. And also we highly recommend you to read our white paper, as it is very technical and contains more information about our research and the results. Very interesting information that we left out of this presentation. And that's it. Thank you very much.